What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic?
Why can't women become priests?
1-833-288-EWTN.
I don't understand why I have to earn salvation.
1-833-288-3986.
What's stopping? Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
What's stopping you? This is Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome back. It's another week of Call to Communion here on EWTN, the Global Catholic Radio Network. Yes, indeed, it is a global Catholic network. In fact, it's the only global Catholic radio network with a program just for you, the non-Catholic, the non-practicing Catholic, never been a Catholic, maybe would think about becoming a Catholic, but you've got some questions that you need to get solved before making that final leap. Well, we are here for you. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening to us outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code, which for most countries is the number 1, and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 55000. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email. The address ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. We're glad to have Michael Birchfield back handling the phone screening today, and of course, Jeff Burson handling social media, as he always does so very well. In fact, if you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, you can do that right there without leaving the streaming platform. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will send that to us here in the studio. I'm Tom Price, along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I'm very well. Say it again.
Say what again?
Your mic wasn't on.
Oh, okay. Hey, Tom, how are you?
Very good. How was that 4th of July weekend for you?
Oh, it was very nice, very nice. How about you?
Yeah, good. It was good. It was good. We had a little surprise. We were called away to a funeral in Mobile, Alabama, but we're very glad to do that, and it all went very well. And last night got to barbecue brats on the grill.
Now, even a vegan like me can appreciate brats on the grill.
Yes.
So I've matured in my experience of fireworks. That's one thing I learned on the 4th. So, you know, the younger me figured you had to work your way up to the good stuff by wasting a lot of time on bottle rockets and sparklers. You know, you go out and buy a bunch of bottle rockets and sparklers, and when everybody's thoroughly jazzed up, then you bring out the real stuff.
Bring out the big guns.
Bring out the big guns.
That's
and I was
right.
like, we are dispensing with the bottle rockets tonight.
Oh.
We're going to go straight into the Roman candles and all the stuff that goes boom, boom, pow, pow. And we all had much more fun.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Sometime I'll tell you about a bottle rocket accident I had with my mother. It did not end well.
Oh, that does not sound good.
We'll leave that one for the break. Here is a question from Joan in Seattle. Very interesting question, rather, actually. She says, Dr. Anders, is it okay for a lifelong, well-educated Roman Catholic to leave the church and join the Orthodox Church and then become an Orthodox priest along with his wife and large family? I don't know what to make of this. Other Catholics seem okay with it. Thanks, Joan in Seattle.
Okay, thanks, Joan in Seattle. I appreciate the question. So if you're asking me if anyone should leave the Catholic Church, the answer to that question is no. No, you should not leave the Catholic Church. No. No. No leaving the Catholic Church.
Don't do that.
Don't do that. Now, so there might be, a person might have any number of motives for that, but there is a way, if a person becomes interested in the Eastern patrimony of Catholicism, there's a way to scratch that itch, if you will, without actually abandoning your communion with the Bishop of Rome. And I mean, church has two lungs, John Paul said, east and west, and everything that's beautiful and good and holy and edifying in the Eastern patrimony of the church is Catholic, and Catholics can and should avail themselves of. You should read the Eastern Fathers. You should participate in the Divine Liturgy. You should nourish yourself on Eastern spirituality and monasticism and all the rest of it. So all that's good. Nothing wrong with that. ought to be engaged in, ought to be in dialogue, ought to be experienced. But you don't want to break with the universal church. You don't want to leave communion with the Bishop of Rome or the bishops throughout the world. So no, I'm not going to say that's okay. It's not okay.
All right, Joan, thank you so much for your email. Here's one now from another person also named Joan. She says, Dr. Anders, can you tell me if there is a Catholic explanation to the concept of fig tree generation, or is this just something popular with end-timers? Now, this person is saying that Pastor Chuck Smith had a specific teaching on this in the 70s. His idea was that because Israel was restored as a nation in 1948, that restoration fulfilled the idea of the budding of the fig tree, as described in Matthew 24:32. Do you know anything about anything of this?
A little bit. So basically, it's not uncommon among dispensational Protestants to try to read current events through the lens of Old Testament and New Testament apocalyptic and prophecy. That's not uncommon. I think it is profoundly misguided and ultimately foolish and potentially harmful spiritually as well as politically. The New Testament is very clear that Jesus spiritualizes the sort of nationalistic, militaristic, monarchical elements of Old Testament religion. The Old Testament is very taken up with questions of kingship and the physical cult of Yahweh in Jerusalem with the temple and sacrifices and the priesthood and the boundaries of the land, and all these are common Old Testament motifs.
Okay.
And the New Testament recognizes that there are important themes in the Old Testament and spiritualizes them. So Jesus himself becomes the new temple, the new high priest, the new sacrifice, and the worship we offer God is not tied to this or that location, John chapter 4, but is rather the worship in spirit and in truth, the offering of ourselves, our bodies, our lives in living sacrifice. St. Peter tells us in his epistle that we are the new temple built on the foundation stone of Christ to make acceptable offerings to God through the purity of our lives. And instead of a ritual purity pertaining to a physical cult in Jerusalem, we have instead the interior purity, the purity of heart, without which no one will see God. That's the thrust of New Testament theology. And Jesus himself says explicitly, my kingdom is not of this world. Right? He repudiates the idea that God's reign is somehow associated with a national, ethnic, physical structure like a nation state.
Okay, very good. John, thank you so much for your call. My mistake, that was not Joan, it was John. Thank you so much for your email. In a moment, we'll get to the phones at 833-288-EWTN on the Tuesday edition of Call to Communion. Do stay with us.
When you deal with God, get out of the way.
The incomparable Mother Angelica. She broke the mold of Catholic teaching with her one-of-a-kind perspective. From her spunky spiritual growth talks to her eye-opening scripture study. A nun like none other.
I intend to scare the hell out of you.
She was the one, the only, the unforgettable Mother Angelica. Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio and television.
Living the Beatitudes with Father Bjorn.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Saint Josemaria Escriva says that we are called to light up the pathways of this earth by being sowers of peace and joy. This comes from being aware that we are sons and daughters of God. On the road of life, though, we find dangers, but God walks with us every step of our life, pouring out the gifts of His Holy Spirit upon us. Our Lady is our companion, like GPS in our car, connected to the cloud and bringing the latest updates to help us navigate our journey and get out of traffic on the way to the eternal kingdom. We don't want to get into family fights on our way to God's vacation destination, but we should be these sowers of peace and joy. We shouldn't accept substitutes, accept only the authentic identity of being His children, His sons and daughters. Let's grow in happiness and bring peace to those around us. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God.
For more about the Beatitudes, visit EWTNRC.com.
It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or if you want to tell us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic, do give us a call at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-EWTN. 288-3986. I want to tell you about something wonderful now available from EWTN's Religious Catalog. It's a book called Custos by Devin Schott. That is Latin for guardian. Custos is a one-of-a-kind 33-day consecration and kind of a spiritual boot camp. It helps men who are or will be fathers to encounter the real St. Joseph, walk with him, become like him. This great book provides a unique combination of daily biblical reflections based on St. Joseph, daily prayers, spiritual practices. It is a truly powerful means of experiencing personal and relational transformation. Now, included with the book is a Custos Spiritual Practices Chart. Very cool. So do check it out. It's available right now at EWTNRC.com. Just put Custos in the search box. EWTNRC.com. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin today with Leo, a first-time caller in Des Moines, listening on the great Iowa Catholic Radio. Hey there, Leo. What's on your mind today?
Hi. I'm getting married in a couple weeks, and my fiance is an ELCA Lutheran, and I wanted to look into getting a dispensation for the marriage. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I reached out to a local parish, and I reached out to the diocese, but I haven't heard anything back from them, so I know that it's getting closer to the date at this point, and I just not really sure how to go about it.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the question. Have you secured a Catholic venue and a Catholic priest to preserve canonical form in case you're not granted a dispensation?
No, she, like I said, she grew up ELCA Lutheran and wanted to have it done by her pastor. And for the early part of our relationship, I wasn't practicing Catholic, but over the past couple of years, I've been trying to get back into it.
Here's what I would urge you to do. I would run and not walk to your parish priest. I would run and not walk to your parish priest, and I would say, "Is there any way that you can help me here, and we can, maybe you can have the Catholic priest present and the Lutheran minister together, but you need to get on this thing right now because you cannot go through that with that ceremony if you don't have canonical form and you don't have a dispensation, then you will not have a valid marriage." And so I would advise you not to conduct the ceremony unless you get a dispensation or you can find some accommodation to preserve canonical form. Otherwise, you're an invalid marriage. And I don't think it's a good way to start because you'd be beginning your relationship with your fiancé or your wife on abandoning your Catholic obligations. And that would, I know her feelings are incredibly important, and I'm not asking you to disregard her feelings. You need to respect her feelings. But in like manner, she needs to respect your religious obligations. And there needs to be reciprocity and mutual respect in the relationship, or you're setting yourself up on the wrong foot. Both parties need to respect this, this disparity of cult. You need to respect her Lutheranism, but she needs to respect your Catholicism. And you can't just throw away your Catholic faith to please her, right? You have to respect each other. So get off the phone with me, and as soon as you have an opportunity, go over and get with the priest and try to get this thing resolved ASAP. If not, I would advise you to delay proceedings until you can either get that dispensation or figure out some way to keep canonical form.
Leo, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. 3 lines open to be specific. 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Tuesday afternoon here on EWTN. Let's go to Patricia now. Patricia is in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, listening on the Great Spirit Catholic Radio. Hey, Patricia, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I'm a recently confirmed Catholic, and I'm having a hard time with the idea of Mother Mary. I want to fall in love with her like everybody else, and I'm just not getting it. I guess my biggest hang-up is she was born sinless, so she couldn't sin. So, I don't mean to sound rude, but how hard is that if that's the way you were born? And my other question is, wasn't she redeemed before she was even put in the womb? Isn't that how she got sinless? And I I just don't know what my relationship with her would be. I don't understand the full idea about Mary.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I can deal with all these questions, and I really appreciate them. And thank you so much for your honesty and recognizing that you want to be Catholic, but there are parts of the tradition that you find difficult to understand, and that's perfectly okay. And I think you're very brave and courageous for sharing those with people.
It takes guts, doesn't it?
So thank you so much for doing that. So first of all, the question: if I develop virtue, or if I have virtue as a gift, so that I can quickly and easily do the moral good. Does that make my life easier? Well, in some respects, to be sure, it does. Yeah, in some respects, I think that would make your life easier. All of us, I think, are conscious that we're kind of at war with ourselves, and our appetites are at war with our reason. And a lot of times we accuse ourselves and we feel pretty bad or guilty because we do something we know we don't need to have that third slice of pecan pie. We go and have it anyway, and then we kick ourselves, and we feel really bad. And so, yes, Mary would have been freed those kinds of struggles because her appetites would have been perfectly under the control of her reason. At the same time, if you've ever been in a social setting or a society organization or a place of employment, for example, where one person is kind of the standout person for virtue and competence, guess who gets all the responsibility in that organization? It's usually not the slacker. The person who's called on to make the most sacrifices by the agency is usually the person who has the most perfected personal virtues and competence. And that was the case with the Blessed Virgin Mary. So the circumstances of her life were tremendously difficult precisely because she had the virtues necessary to deal with them, right? So think about what happened to Mary. She's, say, 14 years old. She's taken a vow of perpetual virginity. She's betrothed to be married, but hasn't yet entered into the full state of marriage, and everybody around her presumes that's what she's going to do, and an angel shows up and says, well, you're going to have a child. And she knows where babies come from, and she knows that she's taken a vow of perpetual virginity, so she says, how can this be? Angel explains it's going to be a miraculous birth. And, she's not one to talk about herself, so she knows that even though she will be morally pure, people are going to have questions. And it's not going to maybe go well for her in society. People are going to look down on her. And even her betrothed, Joseph, is a little bit nervous, kind of weak in the knees when he gets the news that she's showing, right? He's about ready to bolt until an angel tells him, no, this is from the Holy Spirit. But then she's also told, you're going to flee into Egypt. You're going to have to run away from your homeland and go be an immigrant someplace where you don't speak the language, you don't have any means, and when you come back, your son is going to be hated by everybody and tortured to death, and you're going to participate in his ignominious repudiation by the culture, and you'll basically die a widow living in your nephew's house, right? So it was not a party being the Blessed Virgin Mary at all. It was quite difficult. But she was called to this kind of sacrifice precisely because she had the virtue, or rather God gave her the virtue so she could live up to the sacrifice. And the lesson for us, I think, is that God gives us the strength to live the vocation that he's called us to. Right? So not many of us in the world none of us actually, are called to be the mother of God and suffer the kind of loss and indignities and suffering and torment that the Blessed Virgin went through. We're called to lesser sacrifices, and God gives us lesser virtues. And so, we are given the grace necessary for our state of life, and we often find that state of life difficult and painful. Well, she did too. And because of the exceeding greatness of her grace, she was called to exceedingly great responsibility, right? So that's one point. Now, in terms of the question, how should you relate to her? I would encourage you that you don't have to have a lot of positive or any kind of emotions regarding the Blessed Virgin Mary, not yet, at least. And you look around you in the Catholic world and you see other people that just seem just absolutely starstruck with the Blessed Virgin. And, I mean, she's like the superhero that they have posters up on their wall. I mean, literally, Blessed Virgin Mary, and they just can think and talk about nothing else. And you just don't feel like you identify with that. That's okay. That's okay, right? Because true devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary does not consist in sort of sentimental affections or emotions, but in seeking her intercession, knowing that she prays for us, asking her to pray for us, and ultimately in trying to imitate her virtuous example. She said, all generations will call me blessed. And we do that. We acknowledge that she's blessed among women, above all women. I mean, she's the greatest creature that God ever made. And so we acknowledge her virtues and her magnificence and her excellence. And you can do that. You can intellectually acknowledge, yes, Mary is the all-pure, all-holy, sinless, immaculate Queen of Heaven. And I need to seek her intercession, and I need to imitate her virtues. But you don't have to have, a particular sort of affective relationship, like maybe you see the piety around you. There's lots of forms of Marian piety.
Sure.
You just believe what the church teaches, imitate her, pray to her, and then over time, you may or may not begin to develop that deeper emotional bond or connectedness to the Blessed Virgin. Now, I think if you've ever developed a kind of emotional bond with a fictional character, you read a book you really liked, you saw a movie you really liked, and you thought, I really admire this character. This person inspires me, or I identify with them, and it's certainly nothing compared to how we ought to feel towards the Blessed Virgin. But that's a little bit of an analogy about how you can begin to cultivate a relationship with any saint, including the Blessed Virgin, as you let them appear in your imagination as a real person that you could identify with or imitate or respect. And as that begins to kind of work on your imagination, can work on your affections, and ultimately can qualify your life. You can kind of begin to interiorize their virtues and piety, and begins to have a change in how you see yourself in the world around you.
Great question, Patricia. Thank you so much for your call. It is Call to Communion here on EWTN. We have a line open for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. We are live. I want to stress that, since we've been recorded a couple of days here in a row. But we're live on this Tuesday afternoon at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Question that actually came up last week. This was a question here from Christopher, who is talking about something that came in last week and says, Dr. Anders, did I hear you correctly that you disapprove of shiny shoes? Could you elaborate? In other words, wealth. I suppose my question is, to what degree should the church be wealthy or poor? I sense this might be a contentious topic, but I'm interested in both your opinion and any other formal teachings. So I know that we got into health and wealth gospel at some point, and maybe that's what he's talking about.
So I certainly, it would be false to say that I disapprove of wealth. I don't disapprove of wealth, right? Wealth is kind of a neutral moral category. It's what people do with wealth that becomes morally relevant. And there was a period in the church's history in the late Middle Ages when there were sectarian forces that actually made this argument. They said, well, the church should be poor. I mean, in her hierarchy, in her institutions, in her members, the church shouldn't own property. And it really came out of the sort of the left wing of the Franciscan movement. St. Francis was, of course, a great lover of poverty, and Francis kind of took everything to the extreme, and that included his devotion to poverty. And so after Francis's death, the Franciscan order split over the interpretation of Francis's love of poverty. And there were some in the order that said, well, we have to be poor individually, but collectively, like we can have a friary, we can have a microwave and cook our potatoes in it. I mean, we can have stuff as a religious order, but we have to be personally poor. And there was another group that said, no microwaves. Wow. Raw potatoes, nothing. Can't own it collectively, can't own it individually. You have to sleep on the dirt. Got to be totally poor, and that wing went on to kind of cultivate a critique of the whole church, not just of the Franciscan order, arguing that the Pope should be personally poor, the bishops should be personally poor, priests should be personally poor, Catholics should be personally poor, and it was called the Poverty Movement. Lester Little wrote a great book about it. On the spirit of poverty in late Middle Ages. And the Pope said, nope, sorry, that's wrong. That's wrong. That the counsels of perfection, poverty being one of them, are just that. They're counsels of perfection. And they're not mandates or rules that every Catholic has to live by, because people's states of life are different. You have a different state of life, and you have different needs. And so the church does not condemn the possession of physical property, not by the church and not by individual Catholics. So that's very clear. Now, I am very much a critic of the so-called health and wealth gospel that's common in some Pentecostal churches that teaches that faith in God if it's genuine or sincere or powerful or something like that, will in fact bring physical wealth and bodily health. To me, that's empirically false, because most Christians in the world are neither wealthy or healthy, and we will all die of our last disease, and most of us will die in poverty, right? Yeah. So that's just an empirical fact, and is no correlation to holiness. I've known many poor, sick Christians throughout my lifetime who have been exceedingly holy individuals. And Catholic religious, chief among them. The people who've had the greatest influence on me in my own life and my spirituality have been impoverished Catholic religious, and many of them have been sick, although, some of them lived long lives in spite of eating lots of saturated fat.
Okay.
So there you go.
All right, very good. Well, we thank you so much, and we hope that explains things for you, Christopher. We do appreciate hearing from you on this Tuesday afternoon. Got a line open for you right now if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or perhaps you can enlighten us what is keeping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-EWTN. Call now.
Jimmy Aiken, Marcus Grodi, Father John Ricardo. The leading Catholic voices are on the largest Catholic media network in the world. You're listening to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
This is a Messy Family Minute with Mike and Alicia Hernan. Summer's here, and one of the most important things you can do with your children this summer is waste time with them. One of the best ways to waste time with kids is by playing with them. Card games, board games, group games, charades. But why are fun and games so important in family life?
Having fun as a family reminds us that we are more than just a breadwinner or a chore machine. It's a way of reclaiming our identity as a family and spending time on those relationships that matter most. Fun and games helps to grease the wheels in family life and helps everyone to live and work together more effectively.
Enjoying the presence of those we love also gives us a foretaste of heaven, that wonderful communion that we will have with loved ones and with God our Father. So ask yourself and your spouse this important question: how can we play together as a family this summer? For more on this topic, listen to our podcast on games at messyfamilyminute.org.
Now, not only can you watch EWTN anywhere but anytime with EWTN On Demand. Get on-demand access to more than 12,000 EWTN programs, including live shows and specials, all in one place, all free. Just go to EWTN.com/on-demand. There's nothing to fill out, no memberships required, and no fees to pay. All you need is an internet connection, and you're good to go. EWTN On Demand. Fast, easy, and free.
Matt Swaim here. Tomorrow on the Sunrise Morning Show, we'll conclude our series on the Minor Prophets with T.L. Putnam from Verbum by discussing the messianic prophecies in the book of Malachi. Now back to Call to...
It's Called to Communion here on EWTN. Our phone number 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. What is keeping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about it here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Let's go to Travis right now in Colfax, Washington, listening on longtime partner of EWTN's Sacred Heart Radio out of Seattle. Hello, Travis, what's on your mind today?
Okay, so I've been a longtime Catholic, and so nothing's keeping me from the Catholic Church, but on the 4th of July, I had an extensive conversation with a brother-in-law who is Mormon, and he says, well, we don't believe in the Trinity. God the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are three separate gods, and he was continually referring to John chapter 17 as proof of the Mormon position of three separate gods. Well, I read through the chapter. I don't want to read any parts of it to you now, but I don't really see in that chapter at all why they interpret it that way. But I will continue this conversation with them later, and I'm looking for you to help me and guide me. So.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So John 17 and similar passages in the Gospel of John indicate triunity of persons. I mean, that's the Catholic perspective. There are multiple persons in view here. No doubt about it. I mean, there's a dialogue between the Son and the Father throughout the entire Gospel. And Jesus represents himself as being uniquely in relationship with the Father in a way that enables him to reveal the Father. And so, when the apostles say, show us the Father, he says, you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I mean, I'm in intimate union with the Father. I represent the Father. I come forth from the Father. But there's also a distinction of person, right? So the Son is with God and was God from the beginning, and yet it's the Word of God emanating, proceeding from God, that becomes incarnate, and then there's this dialogic relationship between God the Son, God the Father. So that grounds the Catholic doctrine of the Trinity. But to assert that they are like three metaphysically distinct beings would contradict the scriptural teaching on the unity of God, the unicity of God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. That there is but one God is a foundational belief for Christianity and has been for 2,000 years. So, no, I mean, this Mormon exegesis of the New Testament, and the Old Testament too, for that matter, is guided by their own peculiar tradition, which, of course, was invented by Joseph Smith in the mid-19th century, and it is not consistent with 2,000 years of Christian exegesis of the Bible. So, I would prefer to shift the conversation to the credibility of Mormon revelation, to the life of Joseph Smith and his particular claims to revelation that I think are so easily falsifiable. Just take a few instances at random. Smith produced a document called the Book of Abraham that he included in the text that he calls the Doctrines and the Covenants, which, I mean, it's a matter of public record that he bought off of an Egyptian antiquities dealer, and he put forth as a work, purporting to be a work about Abraham. And modern Egyptologists say no, it's actually stitched together from a couple of classic funeral papyri. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Abraham, and it's Smith's whole interpretation, which took place, of course, before hieroglyphics were widely understood by Egyptologists, is just a complete fabrication. Smith's myth about the origin of Native Americans being descended from the tribes of Israel has been falsified by modern genetic evidences. I mean, there's no good reason to take his claims to revelation seriously. And we know from his own personal history that he had some sort of appearance of megalomania, and was pretty good at making up stories and getting people to follow him. And a secular book on the life of Joseph Smith that's I think it's kind of interesting. I read several years ago, American Crucifixion, the Murder of Joseph Smith and the Fate of the Mormon Church, is a kind of an interesting analysis of his personal history and the kind of character that the man had, which is not that of, say, a Catholic saint. I'll put it that way.
Okay. Travis, is that helpful for you?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You are most welcome. Thanks for your call. Call to communion here on EWTN on this Tuesday afternoon. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. If you call right now, we can get you on. 833-288-3986. Here is Johnny in Oklahoma City. Hey there, Johnny. What's on your mind today?
How you doing?
Great.
Can you hear me? I'm kind of in a bad area here.
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Go right ahead.
Okay. My question is I'm not having a problem converting over to Catholicism because I'm actually kind of in the process of it. My problem kind of lies on a different side. It's convincing my mother that I'm not going to hell, because born and raised Pentecostal all her life. I was born and raised in the Pentecostal church, and she has a major issue with this. And one of her biggest issues is she's under the belief that we try to talk to dead spirits, conjure up evil spirits, and I think what she's referring to is when we pray to saints for intercession. And I don't know, and I've been having a problem with finding a good verse that backs that up. And so I'm trying to figure out how to convey that to my mother, that what she's thinking we're doing is not accurate.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate the question. I got a few things I'd like to share with you. First of all, I don't think that you are obligated to prove to your mother that you're not crazy. In other words, I think you're going to become Catholic whether she thinks you're crazy or not. And most of Jesus's personal, family members thought he was crazy. That's what the text says. They were like, he's crazy. We know this guy. We grew up with him. Who does he think he is? And of course Jesus's neighborhood, the larger community, they were so mad at him for proclaiming his messianic identity that they tried to throw him off a cliff.
Yeah.
So following Christ we've never followed Christ in order to endear ourselves to our family members or wider relations. And so if your family thinks that you're nuts for becoming Catholic, well, join the club. You're in good company with Jesus and the apostles, right? So don't worry so much about trying to persuade her that you're not crazy. And I became Catholic, and a lot of my family thought I was pretty crazy. And I have one very close relative who, in fact, had become an atheist. We'd both sort of grown up fundamentalist Protestants, and he'd become an atheist, and I told him I was becoming a Catholic, and he started laughing. And I said, why are you laughing? And he said, because the thought, I don't even believe in hell, but the thought occurred to me, David is going to hell because he's becoming a Catholic. And he's like, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in hell.
Wow.
But it was so drilled into us that Catholics were going to hell that even my atheist relative had a hard time with it, right? So you're in good company. I wouldn't worry too much about that. But in terms of if evidence for the truth or the validity of the Catholic practice of praying to saints, the way you framed the question, I'm having trouble finding a verse. Well, that suggests to me that you still think about religious authority maybe a bit like a Protestant, because the way Protestants operate is they have some belief that they want to justify, and they go poking around in the Bible looking for a verse that would seem to justify it. And I would protest that that's not how we're supposed to think about resolving religious conflicts or religious questions. And the reason why is that Jesus doesn't do that, and he never instructed us to do that, right? So he gave us a rule, a guide for our faith, and it was not poking around in the Bible looking for verses. What Jesus gave us as the authority for our Christian faith is in fact the teaching authority of the Catholic Church. So he founded the church on the rock of St. Peter, said, you're Peter, on this rock I'll build my church, give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What you bind on earth is bound in heaven. What you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. And he goes on to tell the apostles, go therefore into all nations, make disciples, and teach them everything I have commanded you, and I'll be with you until the end of the age. That's a promise of divine assistance. So Christ establishes the church on Peter and the apostles, gives them the command to teach, not to write, not to hand on Bible studies, not to do exegesis or search through their concordances, but teach, and then gives a promise of divine assistance. I'll be with you. I will be guiding you and guaranteeing the integrity of your teaching. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Whoever hears you hears me. So if you want to know what the truth is about the Christian religion, you don't go immediately hunting for Bible verses. You go to the teaching of the Catholic Church. That actually grounds biblical authority. The only reason we know that there is a Bible, the only reason that we have the text of the Bible that we have, the only reason we would know these individual books are inspired is because Catholic tradition has handed that on to us. If you throw out Catholic tradition as the primary authority, the bedrock on which the church stands, you better throw out the Bible too, because the Bible is a product of Catholic tradition. Now, having said all that, there is biblical evidence for the intercession of saints, and I will begin to enumerate that evidence. So first of all, there is a very strong biblical principle that runs through Old and New Testament alike, that holy people, righteous people, are more effective in their prayer life than unrighteous people. St. James says in James chapter 5, the prayer of a righteous man avails much. But the first few chapters of James are all about why you guys are not getting your prayers answered, and he says it's because you're not righteous. Righteous people, prayers answered. Unrighteous people, prayers not answered. Very biblical concept.
Sure.
And it starts out in the book of Genesis, chapter 18. Abraham says to the Lord, will you wipe away the righteous along with the wicked? And God says, well, I'll spare the wicked for the sake of the 10 righteous. On account of the few righteous people, I'll be merciful to the many. That's Genesis 18. Of course, the whole episode with the golden calf in the book of Exodus. God says, out of the way, Moses, I'm wiping these people out. And Moses says, have you forgotten your promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob? That's exactly 3 people, right? And you want to throw Moses in there, you got 4. And here's this countless horde of Israelites. God says, I'm going to wipe them out. And Moses says, how about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? He says, okay. For the sake of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and you too, Moses, I'll spare all those nasty people. All right, so for the sake of the few, I'm going to be merciful to the many. Book of Job, chapter 42. God says to Eliphaz and the other companions of Job, he says, I'm not happy with you guys, but if Job prays for you, I'll forgive you. I'm not listening to your prayers, but if ask my servant Job to pray for you, and then I'll be merciful to you and I'll forgive you. All right. Now, what does this relationship continue after death? Does God continue to favor the prayers of the righteous on behalf of the wicked after death? 2 Kings chapter 13, the prophet Elisha dies, and his relics bring a dead man back to life. So not only does this relationship of intimacy between the holy ones and God continue after death, but it even pervades their physical bodies. The relics of their dead bodies partake in that intercessory power. A book that your mother's not going to like very much, but which is a testament to Hebrew and Jewish belief before the time of Christ, 2 Maccabees chapter 15, we see the prophet Jeremiah, who we are told is praying for Israel, praying for Judea on the edge of battle. The book of Tobit, chapter 12, the archangel Raphael we're told, offers the prayers of Tobias and Sarah to God. Now, she's not going to like Tobit, but that's what the book of Revelation is referring to, and that is in the New Testament. Revelation chapter 5, verse 8, the saints in heaven do exactly what Raphael does. They offer the prayers of the church to God in heaven. And so, both in this life and the next, the saints, the holy ones, intercede on behalf of the rest of the Christian faithful, and their prayers are efficacious. St. Paul can say in Colossians 1, I fill up in my own flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ for the sake of his body, the church. So both Old and New Testament, this life and the next, the saints, the holy ones, pray for us and offer our prayers to God. That's confirmed within sacred Scripture. And it makes sense in the larger view of the Catholic Church concerning its own identity, because we're all members of Christ. And as members of Christ, we participate in the redemption that Christ effected, and we become intercessors. St. Paul says, in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, he says that, we have now become the righteousness of God, meaning we are the tool that God uses to advance his righteous covenant with the nations, and we are the means of reconciling the world to Jesus. There's an intercessory role that the church itself plays on behalf of the world representing God. So this is a deeply biblical idea, and it coheres perfectly well with the church's understanding of itself as that sign and instrument of reconciliation that God has placed in the world.
Johnny, good luck with your mom, and thank you so much for your call today here on Call to Communion on EWTN. We have time for one or two more phone calls if you want to call right now at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Don't forget to join us tonight for Catholic Answers Live at 6 p.m. Eastern right here on EWTN Radio. 2 hours of an open forum Q&A. In the first hour, it is Joe Heschmeyer answering your questions. In the second hour, apologist Tim Staples. Check it out tonight, 6 p.m. Eastern on Catholic Answers Live on EWTN, the exclusive radio home for Catholic Answers Live. Here's a question now from Margot in Waterford, Wisconsin, that is. Hello, Tom and Dr. Anders. Thank you both for the work that you do. As a faithful listener, I find your radio show to be insightful and edifying. Several months ago, Dr. Anders addressed a question about why certain fundamental Christians believe in, quote, the rapture, and why Catholics do not. In his answer, Dr. Anders stated that John Nelson Darby, as the originator of the idea, held to an extremely literal, or perhaps literalistic, interpretation of the Bible, and that to justify this non-biblical secret second coming of Christ, Darby had to, quote, get the church out of the way. So my question is this. Given his literal interpretation, Darby wouldn't have considered the church to be the new Israel, so why would he have to get the church out of the way? Can you please elaborate further on this idea and why it's a part of Darby's eschatology? God bless, Margot.
Yeah, thanks. Really appreciate the question. So you're absolutely right that Darby and other dispensationalists, fundamentalists, they do not like to identify the church with Israel. Now, of course, classic Reformed theology, Calvinist theology, does in fact make that identification, and so they're really differentiating themselves from other Protestants by taking that position. Well, what they hold, the dispensationalists hold, is that the promises to ethnic Israel in the Old Testament are not fulfilled in the church, that they're not fulfilled in the church. And so they have to be fulfilled in a future eschaton. And interestingly, they hold even the teaching of Jesus, which, like on the face of it, Christ is talking to Judea, he's talking to Jews, is not immediately relevant. This is the dispensational position, is not immediately relevant to the lives of Christians, because they see these as unrealizable legal commands that can only be realized again in that future future eschaton. And so the question then emerges: well, if for a dispensationalist, if God's got all this concern with ethnic Israel in the past and future, then what about the church in time right now? And they literally use the language of a parenthesis. They see the church as a kind of parenthesis in the unfolding of the divine plan. And they work that into their premillennial eschatology, where they have the church raptured out of time and space. And so they have the period of tribulation applying to those people who are left behind, and not to the church that gets pulled out of the system. Now, you're asking me, you find some inconsistencies in the logic. Well, join the club, right? I mean, I'm certainly not defending dispensationalism, right? I'm a staunch critic of dispensational theology. I think it's massively misguided.
The whole parenthetical idea is just baffling to me.
Well, Luther divided the entire Bible into what he called law and gospel. This was Luther, not dispensationalist.
Right.
But he saw like the principles of, say, command and promise, or like threat and comfort, as characterizing the whole of biblical revelation. And you had to kind of develop the right sort of dialectical relationship with each of those antitheses. What dispensationalists do is they sort of riff on Luther's distinction between law and gospel, but they split it between Old and New Testament. Right, so they really think of law being not something that characterizes religious life, perennially, as Luther thought, but something that's sort of located in specific dispensations. So they apply a fundamentalist hermeneutic of the Bible, using Luther's division between law and gospel as sort of the guiding principle.
Wow, now I'm really confused. Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it. It is Called to Communion here on EWTN. Deborah, checking in on YouTube. Deborah says, I often hear you say, welcome to the faith, and yet part of what's keeping me away is Catholics seem extremely religious, practicing and doing legalistic, strange, and other things. What am I missing?
Oh, we're strange. We are strange. Yeah, no doubt we're strange. So, no, I don't think you're missing anything. I think that we are religious, and by religious I mean that we engage in ritual cultic practices as a community to express our faith and bond with one another in a common enterprise that stretches back to Jesus, and that's very much by design, right? That the sort of outward accoutrements of the Christian faith, the liturgy, the worship, all these things that sort of bind us together in public life, are very much there for the sake of the society of the Catholic Church. They are there as sort of badges and markers of Catholic identity, so that we can identify our common patrimony and common activities. Like, it is a Catholic thing to do,
right,
to go to Mass. And, none of the elements of the faith on their own are per se necessary for the life of holiness. In other words, God, in some circumstance could dispense with them, and a person could still develop a life of charity and virtue and love, right? And from time to time through history, we see this or that element of the church being dispensed with because of historical necessity. Like, say, for example, Japan, after they threw out all of the Christian missionaries and you had no priests, you had no masses, you just had baptism and the creed and people worshiping in their homes. They didn't have public mass, right? They were still able to retain their Catholic identity, but without all the elements of the religious faith. So, and they could still have lives of virtue and come to holiness, and surely many of them were saved in their deep persecution. So none of the elements themselves are per se necessary, and yet they have a purpose. They're ordained by God, especially the liturgy, to be the authoritative means of handing on the Catholic patrimony and tradition, and to inculcate in Catholics their awareness of participating in a society of a tradition that dates back to Jesus Christ himself. You know, religion, St. Thomas would teach, is a kind of virtue. You know, it's a habit that perfects our interior acts of justice towards God. And that's how we have to view the acts of religion themselves. They're there not as ends in themselves, but to inculcate within us a certain sensibility towards God and the world, namely one of gratitude and honor and recognition of the need to make reparation to the Lord. And so, you know, some people say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious. And my take on that from a Catholic point of view is, well, like everybody's born, like you come into the world spiritual and not religious. Like every baby is spiritual and not religious. It's spiritual because it has an immortal soul. It has a spiritual capacity. But that capacity needs to be honed and trained and made virtuous. One has to make good use of one's spirituality. And the virtue of religion is for that purpose. It's to teach us and train us in how to be truly spiritual, how to worship God in spirit and in truth, so we don't slide off into self-indulgence on the one hand or maybe superstition on the other.
Okay, very good. And thank you so much for your question, Deborah. Glad that you're watching us today on YouTube. We're going to close out here with a classic question that comes up quite often, more often than you might think. This is from Lynn. Lynn says, hello, someone I know is saying it is wrong for us to call priests Father because Jesus said there is only one Father. I don't have the correct response to that. Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah, thanks. So, well, then I guess St. Paul didn't know what he was doing when he called himself the father of the Corinthians or referred to Timothy as his son. Or I suppose that Elisha didn't know what he was doing when he cried out to Elijah, my father, the chariots and the horsemen of Israel. So Christ's prohibition, actually, Jesus never mentions the Catholic priesthood in this passage. So there's no reason to think that he has priesthood as such in view. He's really talking about human fathers, biological fathers.
Right.
And his command is even more radical than you're making it out. He seems to be suggesting, if you take him quite literally, that I can't say dad, to my pa, right? Yeah. And similarly, he makes radical statements like you have to hate your father and mother in your very own life and lands and fields and wives and children and all this, or you can't be my disciple. Now, are we to take Jesus precisely at his word and conclude that we have to hate our relations and we can't acknowledge our familial connections with people? No, I don't think that anyone would read Christ in that way. Rather, he's saying we can't prefer any of these things to the honor of God. Earlier in the show, we had a couple people call who had family relations that were complicating their Catholic life. They wanted to be Catholic, and their relatives were impeding them in some fashion. Well, this is what Christ anticipates, that we can't let natural human affinity stand between us and our religious duty to God. That's really what's at issue here. But in terms of using the term father as a reverential term for religious leadership, the New Testament does that. The Old Testament does that. I mean, there's clear biblical warrant for that practice.
Sure. I mean, you hear references Father Abraham.
Yep.
And the like.
Had many sons, right arm, left arm.
There you go.
You know that song. You don't know that song.
I don't know that song.
Well, that's because you didn't grow up in fundamentalist land. We used to sing, Father Abraham had many sons had... I'm not going to go on. I'd be making a fool of myself. And it's a little kid's song, and then you add arm and leg movements, and so you get a room full of 4-year-olds doing this, and it's a riot, man.
It sounds like a lot of fun.
There's a dance that goes with it, and I remember doing this at age 4, and I had no clue who Abraham was or why I was singing this. All I knew was I was pumping my arms and legs and going around in a circle, having a grand time.
Hilarious.
Anybody who grew up in evangelicalism knows this little episode from childhood.
Yeah, watch that.
That and flannel graphs. You do know flannel graphs,
I do know flannel graphs.
Man, I thought the New Testament was written on flannel graph for the longest time.
Wow.
Sheep were made out of cotton.
Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, watch for the YouTube of David doing all that. Anyway, check us out tomorrow right here on EWTN Radio for Call to Communion at 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders and our fantastic crew. We will see you then. God bless.
Tomorrow morning on the Sunrise